for a company need, for example, Visual Studio, company pays the cost or client pays the cost. And when it comes to freelancers or individuals like you and me, so for individuals, one can very well start using community edition of Visual Studio, let's say community 2019, for example. And then we can start developing some sort of softwares, we can do the evaluations, and we can very well deliver the applications. And then, nobody asks a word. So this thing, we are like, for individuals it's good, but then for companies it is always paid kind of a case edition, not community, but professional and ultimate. And then barring that, the major cost today is spent by any of the client is on deployment. So if at all we have something like, let's say maybe a web form application that you develop or ASP.NET application you develop, then even if you go to, let's say, a website like GoDaddy, or if you go to a vendor like GoDaddy, you'll find out the cost that is involved, the deployment cost is always on higher side. And then one can very well have it, like, since it's a like open source thing, so we can have it cross platform, which means we can very well maybe deploy, we can very well create and run these applications on multiple platforms. Multiple platforms which are popular, you can always have it on top of Linux, you can always have it on top of, let's say, Mac, or you can have it on top of something like, let's say, Windows. Nobody prefers to deploy or have a Mac as a server. So normally Linux server or Windows server, these are popular categories that we have. So for development, one can very well use Mac, or development, anybody can use any of these things which are mentioned in front of you. So we have, like, .NET Core framework. So this was very simple initially, but then obviously that it was a new trend which started in 2015. And then we have a lot of versions since then. So we have got 1.0, we have got 1.1. Then in, you can say, 2018 or so, we have got 2.0, we have got 2.2, and right now we are working on 3.1, 3.0, 3.1, 3.2. So right now we are working on 3.1, let's say. So there has been an evolution with respect to, you can see, these versions that we have. And then one of the version that we are going to use today is this one, that is 3.1 version, wherein you will notice what we have is a lot of features we are going to discuss. We are going to have a lot of comparisons with respect to ASP.NET web form and ASP.NET MVC specifically. So why do we should prefer maybe ASP.NET Core over something like maybe ASP.NET MVC, normal MVC, or ASP.NET web form? You will get an answer in today's session itself. Then barring these web applications, like, this is something we have been doing since 1.0 version of .NET Core. But then there are few additions that you will see that since the 3x version, I would say 3.x, which means any version after 3. So any of the, like, 3 dot version that you have, you will find out with any of the 3 dot version, one can very well develop. Now today we can develop applications like, we can develop anyway console applications, but we can develop desktop applications, we can develop mobile applications, we can also develop something which is called as microservices, if you have heard of it. Then we can very well develop something that is maybe machine learning applications, we can develop IoT applications using something that is .NET Core itself, which means this has been a kind of, you can say, a complete new area open for .NET developers when it comes to so-called, you can say, 3x. And that too, it is like, I'm talking about cross-platform features over here. So it's a 3x: desktop, mobile, microservices, ML, IoT, Linux, Mac, Windows, all on it's just a bunch of services which are offered from Microsoft now. So our agenda will be like working majorly on console application. We will be working on web and MVC. We will be working on APIs in this entire discussion, and we will, you can say, touch to some extent something called as Razor pages. So there is also one more thing that I forgot to mention here. There has been something called as Razor pages like applications. So if you are familiar with, let's say, ASP.NET web forms, you'll find out to some extent, you can say, a similar approach we have had, or we have had with respect to Razor pages. So that is something which is which may be new to some of you. But then MVC is something, to some extent, things remain same. But when it comes to .NET Core, there are certain things which we don't have. For example, when it comes to, let's say, if you have ever worked with .NET or other, maybe entity framework, we typically have a database first approach wherein we can grab some tables and we can generate some sort of classes. So if at all, let's say you see that approach is gone now, wherein you will have to follow something like, let's say, code first or model first like approach, which means more of a code you will end up writing in case of .NET Core. You can leverage, so-called you can say better performance by writing more amount of code in this case. So obviously something comes at the cost, performance will come at the cost of, so-called you can say when you start writing the code. And then when it was ASP.NET Web Form, we always have had issues. Something like in Web Form, there was a partially auto-written code, partially UI generated. There's a what we call as hundreds and thousands of lines of code automatically written, and you will find out it always has a minus point in terms of, you can say, performance. So I'm not going to go into the AS.NET Web Forms performance, but then specifically from the web server perspective, we will have a look at it today. So ultimately, one can very well start developing the applications on any of these so-called, you can say, frameworks that we have. So one can very well go and develop something on Linux, Mac, and Windows platform itself. So why did I ask you to install on your machine something like VS 2019 then? Why did I ask you to install something called as maybe .NET Core 3.1 SDK on your machine? And then barring that, I also asked you to have something like Windows 10 as an operating system also, because this is kind of, you can say, prerequisite. So here, working on Windows, working on VS19 community, and then .NET Core 3.1 SDK, this is something that we are going to go and do throughout the course. However, it's not hard and fast that you should always go and start using these things only. As I said, one can very well use Linux, Ubuntu, one can very well use Mac, and one can very well use VS Code itself for development. Is this VS Editor compulsory, Visual Studio 2019? Absolutely no. It is not at all compulsory kind of a editor. So what you can do is you can always have so-called maybe VS Code used, and one can start the development itself. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to simply check here what installations we have on the machine. So let me save this whiteboard and let me switch context to desktop now. So I'm going to share the screen with you. So let me go to screen now. Here we are. So let's say we can start Visual Studio, and then before that, what I want to do is I want to create a folder on a desktop. Let's call it as core, and then all core demonstrations will be in this particular folder itself. So let me open this. Let me put here CMD. And then, as I said, it is possible that we can very well run the applications. We can very well create the applications using a command prompt itself. So what we can do is, in order to check what version of core you have installed, you can very well go to command prompt and put a code or command like .NET and then dash dash version. This is similar to, you can say, node dash dash version, so that you can check the node version on your machine. To check the TypeScript, you can have TSC and dash dash version. You can see the TypeScript installed on your machine. Similar way, we can check here which version of .NET Core you have installed on the machine. So here, what it tells you is 3.1.101 build is installed on my machine. So similar way, please check what is on your machine, maybe whenever you will have hands-on. Like before we proceed, here, this entire session is going to be like demonstrations, is going to be discussions, is going to be so-called proof of concepts that we will have. And then what you can do is you can raise questions, concerns at any point of time. If there are, let's say, anything that you are trying out at your place on your machine, whatever we do here, let's say you try it today or tomorrow, and then if there are any kind of issues that you have, you are free to put up the questions, raise the concerns questions on the group that we have, or you can very well shoot an email and you can very well maybe look for the answers. So like till the session is over, and even after the sessions, if at all there is any concerns, you're free to contact me, or we can always have a discussion over here itself. So right now we have 3.1.1 installed. So now what we want to do is, imagine I have not started Visual Studio, and then I really want to create a new project itself over here. So in .NET Core, one of the good part is we can very well have here, entire project created within the command prompt itself. So what I'm going to do is just going to go and create a directory. Let's call it as a demo over here. So I'm just going to go and move to a directory called as demo over here. Let's clear the screen. And what we want to do now let's say in order to create a project, what we can do is we can say .NET. Now, obviously using .NET project, what you can do is you can create any new project, .NET Core, I mean to say. So when you put a command called as .NET, you would like to create a new project. So you can put new, but then what project would you like to create? As I said some time back, you can create microservices, you can create console applications, MVC, web applications, Razor pages, and whatnot, ML and everything. So in such cases, how do I know what application to start? So if you don't know what to put up over here, just hit enter. After you hit enter, you will find out these are the kind of, you can say, short names that we have over here. So would you like to create a console application using so-called, let's say .NET Core? Then you can just put a word called as console. Would you like to create a WPF application using .NET Core, WPF libraries, or WinForms, or so-called, you can say maybe something like Blazor applications or Angular, React, whatever. I would like to create here MVC application. So I'm just going to go and pick up here a word called as MVC. So it's going to go and help me create ASP.NET Core web application using MVC. Again, on the right side, you will find out the languages that we can prefer. So normally the applications that we can create here, in .NET Core applications can be created using these three languages typically. We can have C# support, we can have F#, and we can have VB as in project support. So these are the three, so-called, you can say, major languages that we use in case of .NET Core. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put here .NET New. As you can see here, we have options .NET New, MVC, and we can specify n number of things. So I'll mention here .NET New. I would like to create MVC application. Now I need to provide a name to my application. So I may say here dash dash, and we can provide a name to the application. So let's call it as, let's say, test. So test is my project name. As and when you hit enter, it is going to go and create the application now. Let's hold on. Okay, it says the switch is basically failed. So ideally it should have given, sorry, the problem is I should have given here dash dash name, and then I should have given the name for the application. So let's hit enter now. So what it does is it tries to create a project. Now, as you can see, it has successfully created so-called the project. Now, I really want to open this project and see how it looks like. So even if you don't have Visual Studio, .NET or Community Edition on your machine, if you have VS Code installed, VS Code is a free editor. It's a lightweight editor that anybody can get on Mac, on Ubuntu, and as well as on Windows. So in order to open this project, what you can do is you can just put here code dot. Let me go into the folder first, test folder I will go to. And then as you can see here in the directories, you will find out this is the project structure that we have over here. What I wish to do, I wish to open this project in VS Code. So what I will do is I'll just put here code dot. So through this command, I'm just going to go and open a Visual Studio Code. I'll hit enter. This will open Visual Studio Code. And then there we are. And now you'll find out the project structure is very simple. There's a test project file. There's a startup.cs, program.cs. Some JSON files are there. Then there are some static files that you see. And then there is controller modules and views that we have over here. Okay, so I wish to run this project. Normally in case of Visual Studio, plain Visual Studio, it is too easy to ultimately what we call it as, compile the project and run the project. In order, like after you're done with changes in here, suppose if I open home controller, for example, this is where right now the C# extension is not installed, but then to get an IntelliSense with respect to C#, one can very well install the extension and one can very well get C# IntelliSense over here itself. This is similar, looks like similar to Visual Studio Community only. Now what I wish to do is I wish to compile my project, compile, maybe get the output and run the output. To do that, what you can do, either you can use the command prompt which is inbuilt with respect to the Visual Studio Code itself, or you can use the typical command prompt that you have over here. How do I compile my project? So what you can do is you can just put here .NET and then run. So when you put a .NET and run command, by going into the project folder, it is just going to go and build the project and it's going to go and run it. So let me hit enter over here. Let's see what happens now. So this is just going to go and compile the project, and then it is going to go and start a server over here. It's going to go and start at HTTP using HTTPS and as well as HTTP. over here. So what we can do is we can very well copy this localhost URL and we can go to the browser in this case. So on the browser, we can just put up this so-called you can say URL and see to it, it has successfully tried to run the test project that we have. So this is the test project that we created. There is a home page, there is a privacy page. Suppose if I just go to, let's say this welcome word, which is written maybe on the home page, what I can do is I can go to VS Code here. Wherever that word is written, let's say in the test, it's in views. So if I just go to views, if I just go to home, and if I open index, there was a word written called as learn about so and so, and there is a welcome word. There's a home page word. As you can see it over here, there's a welcome, for example. So maybe I'll just mention here, welcome to, let's say .NET Core. So if I just go and save this, one more time, what I'll do is Control C will stop the server, application will shut down, and then let's try to run it again. So save this, change this, try to recompile and run the server again. And then what we can do is we can just refresh over here. The time we refresh over here, now you'll find out we have welcome changed to welcome to .NET Core, which means one can very well keep on doing changes with respect to the .NET Core application in the VS Code itself. One can very well save the things and one can very well utilize like no Visual Studio kind of environment. You can use VS Code, you can use Notepad, you can use whatever editor you want. But then what is suggested is I still suggest Visual Studio community, because that way IntelliSense, or you can say easy development tools is what we have, or utilities are embedded with respect to Visual Studio community or Visual Studio in general than VS Code. But then if you really have some sort of, you can say, maybe issues during the installation, maybe you have issues with respect to systems or specific operating system is what you're working on, then in such cases, you can very well use .NET Core or start coding in .NET Core from anywhere. So I'm going to stop the application now. Let's clear this and then let's close this .NET command prompt. So now what we have to do is, let's say I'm going to close this as well. How did it run in the first place? Did it start IIS Express somewhere over here? You will notice it did not start IIS Express at all. So I've started recording and now let me share the screen with you. So this is the same Visual Studio that we used other day. Same instance of core demos we have. Two projects we created other day. One is demo and demo web. So and then the way we created projects, it was like picking up a template. It is what matters. So what templates do we have? We will try to understand those and some core features of ASP.NET Core MVC. So let's do one thing. Let's pick up one project at a time. So we picked up, let's say, demo project. I have reloaded this. And then if you recall, what we did other day was something like we tried to create a host builder. We tried to understand what host builder does. It just tries to set up your so-called, you can say, server related things, which means whether you are working with respect to something like, setting up logging, setting up certain features like maybe whether you are, let me go to startup first. Yeah, setting up something like, maybe whether you are going to use MVC, whether you're going to want to use something like typical static files and so on. All those, and configuring middlewares is something that actually happens with respect to that web host. And then there are like two different methods that we created: configure services and configure. And then this method gets called first. Then there are like these so-called, you can say, app.use. In the sense, the middleware configurations is what we have. So I'll have to mute all of you. Yeah, okay. So now what we have here is in this demo project that we did other day, we try to understand how middlewares work. And then it is easy to configure middleware. So we try to understand some basic differences between typical ASP.NET or ASP.NET MVC that we used to use versus in .NET Core. So by default, when you host your application on top of, let's say, IIS or IIS Express, IIS Express is for development only. So when you configure your application on top of IIS, what happens is certain things like configuring modules or so-called, you can say, handlers is something that is not in your hand, which means whenever your application is deployed, ultimately application will have to go through certain number of modules, certain number of so-called, you can say, middlewares, I would say. in the terms of ASP.NET Core. But then in case of normal web form and normal ASP.NET MVC, you will see those things we just can't skip. We will have to go through the process. So even if it's a simple hi hello kind of a file that I have in ASP.NET web form and MVC, still I will have to ultimately go through entire life cycle or entire series of middlewares, and that actually makes kind of, you can say, the entire process unnecessary and slow. So if at all we really want to configure those, then we have a way to configure middleware over here. So we definitely, we will only be able to get to those things which we desire. So for example, here app.use we used other day. So we try to write a middleware wherein we try to take a what we call it as context for a while, work with the context, and further forward that context for the next processing. Here also we capture the next context. We try to append some word to it like hello to, and we further forward that context to the next middleware. And that way you can keep on configuring middleware the way you want it. And we can very well, the final middleware will simply not have something called as next called. And then ultimately what we'll have is since next will not be called, that middleware will ultimately be reverting back the final response that we have. So configuring middleware was never that easy, through code. So what we have to do today is we will have to understand certain structure, certain things in the application itself. So as we discussed other day, or whatever we discussed on other day, based on that, I have few questions for you. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and launch a poll. You will receive questions in front of you. And then what I want is I want you to quickly answer those questions. So I'm going to launch the poll now. So I'm waiting for your answers. Okay, 6 of 11 have answered as of now. 8 of 11. So all of you should be able to see the poll now. Okay, I'll have to check that. It should be directly in front of you, like it should directly appear on a screen. If it's not, can you please click on the poll section and see if at all you can see it. So okay, so great. So ASP.NET Core middleware can be configured easily compared to routine ASP.NET MVC and waveform. That is the that second question, wherein I have two wrong answers. Okay, fine. So anyway, so normally it should be. I haven't attended any kind of, you can say, Zoom as a participant, so maybe I'll have to check it. But then it doesn't matter. What we can do is we can see, all of us can see the poll. So can you see it on my screen, like when I'm sharing the screen? No. Okay. Okay. So okay, that's fine. That's fine. So let me end the poll, and then a couple of you have answered it wrong. So it's like this. The first question that I asked you is AS.NET Core application can be hosted on Linux-based Apache server. And the answer is true. So 10 of you have answered it correctly. AS.NET Core middleware. Maybe if you're attending, like most of you are attending it from, you can say, the Zoom app. Ultimately, Zoom needs to be installed on the machine. And most of you must have downloaded that plugin, and most of you have started with that. And those who are attending over the web may have a concern, and those who are attending over the mobile may not have a concern, or may have a concern. I need to check that. But then AS.NET, that should not be a concern, because as long as you are able to see the demos and as long as you are able to understand the concept, that's what matters. So AS.NET Core middleware can be configured easily to compare to routine AS.NET MVC and waveform. So answer is true, that normally middlewares in AS.NET can be configured to the easiest way, compared to, you can say, what we used to do in waveform and MVC. In waveform and MVC, we used to literally write classes inheriting from something called as IHTTP module. Somewhere we used to, rather IHTTP module is sufficient. And then we literally used to configure most of the things, because most of the things were not in our control. And to take a control, we used to literally write classes, libraries, DLLs, which used to have classes inheriting from IHTTP module. And then those IHTTP module kind of, you can say, maybe libraries, we used to inject into existing application through web config file, and then we used to use it. It was a tough process. It was a lengthy process. Here it's just a matter of writing a couple of lines of code and then invoke whatever you need. So it's a bit faster. Then third question I had was AS.NET Core application is a console application behind. So this is true that it is, it's a console application. I'm going to stop sharing the results now, and then I'm going to close the poll. This was the first and last poll for the day. So coming back to the discussion now, how exactly this thing or this processing happens. So as our target is learning AS.NET MVC core, so what we have to do is we will have to shoot a call to MVC, and then we will try to understand the life cycle of MVC core specifically. So if you recall, the other day we did this. I had it commented. So whenever there is a get kind of a call, I had a async kind of a can say call, and I printed hello from console app, I believe. Then I'm just going to go and let's say comment certain things here. Let's try to run this console application first. So it is console, so we will obviously be able to see a demo over here while we run it. So there is a call given to 5001, or yeah. So, and if I just hit F12 here, if I just refresh here over the network, when I hit a call, what I'll see is who's serving me is right now in the response. I get to know that server called as Kestrel is basically serving me as of now. So great. So we have server, hello from console app. We collected the so-called, you can say, context in between, and we simply presented as a response hello from console app. Now, what is it that we have to do is we need to configure this application to some extent. So here we go to solution. There's a very important file that we have under, you can say, properties folder of the application, which is called as launch settings. So by default, what did I say is when you run this application, there's a port number that comes up here. So run this again one more time. See the port number. So we are running it on Kestrel server, and on Kestrel when we run, by default it picks up 5001 as a port number. Can I configure this? What if I have something already running on 5001 port number? So in such cases, what you can do is go to launch settings.json file under your properties folder, and there you'll find out we can actually go and pick up so-called the what we call as port numbers. So when we run this application, maybe with respect to, let's say, IIS. So when we run it on IIS, by default, it actually picks up a port number 63046. The application URL will be this. Then by default, when we run it on IIS Express, this is IIS setting. By default, when we run it on IIS Express, there is no special setting that we have. So by default, IIS Express is kind of so-called, you can say, descendant to the IIS. So you'll find out settings of IIS are automatically taken by IIS Express, though you can configure it by yourself as well. So point to understand is IIS settings say that 63046 is your port number. Same settings are applicable to IIS Express. Why did not I see 63046 when I try to run it? Because if you see, when we run it, it runs in two different profiles right now. One is IIS Express, as you can see here in the start window, IIS Express, and second one is demo. So if I pick up IIS Express, it will pick up 63046 as it is inherited into these settings here. And then there is a demo that we have. If I pick up that demo, means I'm using a Kestrel server over here. And Kestrel server means we have specified application URL as, let's say, 5001 or so. So let me remove this other one that we have. So if at all I really wanted to have some sort of, you can say, different kind of settings to be done. So suppose if I have to change this, so I may go and pick up here, let's say 9999 as in the, you can say, URL. So I picked up a different port number now, 9999. By default, Kestrel server will always prefer to use 5001 as a port number. Let us see what happens now when we run this project. So we are running it on Kestrel server. And now there is something called as you can see, localhost 9999 is where my application is running. And that's where we see hello from console application. So things to understand is we have here, let me go back to code. Let me close it. Things to understand here is application URL. I managed to change it to 9999. Okay, there is a, why did you not build this project? So by default, what happens is when we run this application, I try to run this application using Control F5 initially. So by default, you will find out the so-called, you can say, Kestrel server was running behind the scene. And then as and when I was running using Control F5, so server was running behind the scene. Any kind of a changes I do, the changes get reflected. The changes are noted by the so-called, you can say, the Kestrel running console application, and those changes are going to get accommodated. So I literally don't have to keep on rebuilding everything, but then rebuilding every time is a good thing. So if you have ever worked with Angular like theory or Angular like application, you will see any changes that you do to the Angular. There is a concept called as live server, and those live server will automatically keep on so-called, you can say, accommodating the changes. So exactly in the same manner, this Kestrel server also works. So what we have to do is, yeah, nodemon kind of a command. So nodemon will just keep on monitoring the, you can say, changes, just like live server. So live server also uses something similar. So now what we have here is localhost colon 9999. So I changed the settings. You will also see there are certain other settings that we have, something called as development setting over here. The word mentioned is development. So I'm sure about this, most of you have seen scenarios wherein we will have to have several other settings for development and some different settings specifically for production. So in such cases, typically we have to have settings like development, then there can be production, there can be staging, there can be testing, and there can be variety of customized settings that you would like to have. Like, would you like to launch a browser? Would you like to have like those so and so port number used during development? So you'll find out these settings are by default here in a launch settings.json file. This file is something that is always there in a properties folder, which means if I open my project in a file explorer, you shall see there's a properties folder and there's a launch settings.json file. So you will understand that this launch setting.json file that we have here, that I know that is kind of, I can say, editable file. So one can, like, during deployment or during, let's say, even after deployment, if you wish to change some settings over here, you can very well open it using Notepad or any kind of editor and do the changes, on the fly over here. So right now, let's say if development settings are there, I really wanted to have some X message. If it's a production, some Y message. Quickest way to handle this is, suppose if you really want to have a knowledge about it, one can very well go and quickly check over here what sort of settings we get. As we notice during the configuration, one can very well see get over here. That is what sort of environment we are working in. So you'll find out there's an environment parameter which is going to go and read these details for us and can offer it to us. So simplest example, I really wanted to put here something called as environment dot here, something called as environment name. So if at all the environment read from the project is development, let's say the word was development, I believe. Yeah, development. And then I really wanted to have it in if loop. So if the word is development, then do something else. Maybe you are not in development. So I'll just try to put up here on a console. Instead of putting hello from console app, let's specify here you are in development. Maybe let's say environment. Yeah. And then otherwise, I just wanted to put up on a console something like you're in a production environment or so, or other environment, I would say, instead of production. And then we can very well run this code one more time, run the console, run the application. It should launch the browser automatically and should give me you are in a development environment. Suppose if I just go back to the code, if I just make a small change in the launch JSON settings here, instead of that, I'll just mention here, sorry, not here. I just try to put a change here, production. This change is happening with respect to Kestrel server. So a change is there, and you'll find out now on a UI, what I should see is you're in other development environment also. So things change very easily when we start working with changes like this. And then these settings are different, IIS Express versus so-called Kestrel server. Then obviously what things can happen here, since in the code itself you are able to get to know that whether you are in development mode or you are in production mode or you're in testing and staging. Accordingly, what you can do is you can keep on injecting, let's say, something.js file versus something.mean.js file, something.css or something css.mean file, and so on. So it's up to you, like, what sort of references, what sort of things to add on. Anyway, we will come back to the environment settings and the code with respect to it in a while. But then things to understand is sequentially, there are certain things read automatically by the .NET Core, you can say, engine. And these launch settings.json is something which is one important file that we have, which can be changed on the fly uh, during the, you can say, application run. So now what we have to do is, this application is actually doing nothing. This console application is simply printing on a console some hi hello kind of a content, or some sort of, you can say, plain text on a UI. I really wanted to have kind of, you can see, environment wherein I can return some sort of HTML pages. I can return some sort of content back to the end user. So instead of reinventing the wheel, instead of recreating the entire structure and every packages, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and switch to demo web app now. So let me unload this project setting and go back to demo web settings over here. By default, what do we have in this demo web app? What sort of, you can say, content we picked up, we will try to understand. So let's do one thing. Let's rather add a new project, and let's try to understand the template structure first of all. So let's open yesterday's project, and then let's look at home controller. So under home controller, you will notice there is something called as home controller inherits from controller. And I said, if there is a method, yesterday I believe we picked up test controller. So yesterday I said, that is, whenever test/index get called, this method gets called. And then in the life cycle, we discussed about it, something like, whenever test controller/index method gets called, ultimately somebody has to create object of test controller. And I mentioned that in a reflection, somebody creates object of it. And this method index is also going to get called automatically somewhere in the life cycle. So you'll find out this is not the direct method which gets called, because maybe before this method, I would like to have authorization. I would like to have authentication. I would like to have some sort of, you can say, data massaging to happen before my method gets called. And maybe after this method gets called, what I want to do is I would like to have some sort of UI processing done. And then maybe there can be some caching that I would like to do. There can be n number of things that we would like to do. So thing is, like, index method is not the direct method which gets called here. There are like several other methods which get called in the sequence. So how do we see a sequence of those methods? How do we see those methods getting called automatically? And then the answer, how index or how any method of some X class gets called, let's say, in a sequence which is defined by base class. So that is something answer you will get in that video. So if you haven't watched it yet, I insist that you watch it. So again, coming back to point now, what we want to do today, we would like to play with some data. So yesterday, what we did was, under model section, we did not define anything. So we haven't, rather, in the views, there was something called as test, and there was simple index page that we defined, which simply said hello from test index. But then I really wish to present some sort of data in the UI. That data can be simple employees data, simple collection, it can be anything. So let's try to do one thing. We will do two things today. We will try to do all the CRUD operations with respect to collection today, not database. And then same collection, same CRUD operations, we will try to do with the collection through UI as well. So we will do, I can say, things which basically may make this application work more like a web API. And then things like, we may make this application behave in a more or less, you can say, from the CRUD and UI perspective, I would say. So anyway, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go to models here. As we discussed here, models is just a kind of, you can say, entity or a class whose objects are going to go and hold data for you. And ultimately, multiple objects, ultimately collections, are going to go and hold the data for you. So it doesn't matter whether you are working with, let's say, database, or you're working with files, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, that data will be, you will have to bring it into some sort of, you can say, class objects. The object properties, getter setters, will hold that data, members will hold that data, and those members is something that we can actually go and bind to the UI. So here's what I'm going to do. Under models, I'm going to go and add a class here. Then let's name that class as in, let's say, maybe student. And that student class will have a couple of properties. I'll just use a couple of auto properties quickly. I'll have integer ID, I'll have integer, or the string name, and I'll have here, let's say, address. Maybe I'll provide here ID as an ID or number will do over here. Yeah, I'll keep it as it is. So this particular student class will hold some sort of data. What I need is I want students collection to be created. Again, it's up to you whether you would like to populate the data over here itself, or you can very well manage this in the controller itself. So I'm going to play with the test controller one more time, as this was our startup, so called you can say controller and a method in yesterday's case. So I'm just going to have one private method here. Let's call this private method, which returns me, let's say, list of students. So obviously student won't appear in the IntelliSense. So we will have to go and use models here. Again, we will have to mute someone. Okay. So we have, let's say, private list of students, and let's say get students is the method that we have here. Okay, I'll just mute. Okay. I hope you're able to see the screen, guys. Yeah, everybody else is able to see it. So Abhijit, there is a problem at your end. So anyway, so we have list of students and we have, let's say, a method called as get students. And since it's a private method, I'm just going to consider this more like a, you can say, factory. So I'm just going to have a hard-coded content. I'm not dealing with database today, because dealing with database here is a bit different than what we how we deal with in case of normal console applications or normal .NET framework applications. So anyway, you will get to know more about it as and when we talk about something called as entity framework or core entity framework, which is a bit different than the traditional entity framework that we use. So what we'll do now is we will have here, let's say, somebody's waiting, I believe. No. So here we will return some sort of list of students. So let's have hard-coded list of students as of now. And then we will return, or we will create new students over here. ID equal to 1. This is very routine code. Let's put it as and let's quickly create 3-4 students here, just for the sake of adding some records here. Then we will have some records like 1, 2, 3, 4, or 15 maybe records over here. We will just try to add some records. Let's quickly add here. Let's add one more. And then we will just try to have some sort of records added. Let's say Panji, maybe Mumbai, and so on. So let's say these are the records that we have as of now. So what happens now, these records or this list of students that we have, I would like to use this, you can say again and again. So I'm not interested in, rather we can call this directly, so should not be a concern, because I have a plan to call this in the class itself. Otherwise I was thinking of making it static. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So what I want to do is, whenever somebody shoots a call to test/index, what happens is I would like to get this list of students and I would like to ultimately return this list of students. So here, in case of MVC, just like we can return, what is mentioned here is I action result. Yesterday, in case of index, there was something called as view result also, or there is something which is called as action result also. So there are multiple number of return types that we can have. From here, we can also return string as well. Normally, you wouldn't have, or you may not have returned string or simple, let's say maybe integer kind of, you can say, contents from a typical controller. Normally, those who have worked with MVC earlier, you may see that returning something called as object of some type which implements action result or which is from I action result is something which is mandatory. in typical cases, unless until you really have your own kind of a maybe a controller structure created. But here you will find out a kind of, you can say, not traditional kind of, you can say, replies from MVC, like returning a string is also possible. However, my intention is not to return a string. My intention is to return something called as JSON. So I'm just going to go and return here a JSON result. And then how do I convert my list of student into JSON? You don't really have to do anything. You just have to say return a new JSON result, and you will simply pass on the object value. Had it been traditional MVC, you would have seen something like directly JSON result we can't return. You will have to specifically say here allow the get request. You will have to specifically say data equal to whatever data you have. So a bit of change in case of core, that is, you can very well return the JSON result by simply consuming whatever get result has to say or get student has to say. So what get student will do, guys? This dot get student, when I say this is just going to go and return me list of students. This entire list of students will be converted into JSON format, and that JSON is something we will be returning back to the end user whenever somebody gives a call to test/index. So let's do one thing. Let's shoot a call now to this particular method. I believe I already have some breakpoints added in yesterday's based on yesterday's discussion. So let me go to startup, and yes, there were some breakpoints that we used yesterday. So I'm just going to go and remove these breakpoints, and we will just try to run this demo. So run here. Let's see what happens now. Okay, here we run. I'm running it on Kestrel. Um, these breakpoints is what I'm going to go and remove. And let's try to shoot a call to test/index. Okay, this is the default call, as you can see, /test/index. And now you will see entire data is returned in the form of JSON over here. And then this is simple get request. I believe everybody is aware of get and post, which is, you're maybe well versed with the get post kind of a request. So it's like, okay, two of you are not from that background. So what I'm going to do is, so here's what I'll do. Let me go and have a new share over here. Quickly go to whiteboard and quickly make it, easy to understand. So there is something like this. Let's say there is a request that you send or a response that you send generally. So in the header, what goes is your typical details like so-called, header and body. Rather, there's a header, there's a body that we have. So imagine this is typical HTTP protocol that we have. And then in the protocol, what we have here is something called as header and something called as body over here. So now what happens is when data travels in the header section, normally you will call that request as get request. And when data travels in the body section, typically you will call it as a post request in general. So data travels in the header in get, data travels in the body in case of post. Then there are several other things that we have. Something like what if I really want partially some amount of data, like some sort of, you can say, primary information to travel in the header, and some sort of, I can say, other extra information I wanted to travel in the post also. Then, kind of a combination, we can always convey here something called as put kind of a request, we can consider it as. So there will be something called as put kind of a request that we may have. There is something that we have something called as, let's say, in case we wish to delete something, we can actually provide a delete command in the header itself, and we can convey in a header something called as I would like to delete some record which is with so and so kind of a number or so and so kind of a primary key. So in delete also data travels in the header, but then a special command, a kind of, you can say, maybe I would say a special statement is what is we are going to go and pass on to the server, something like, we would like to delete some sort of content from a server. So based on how have you raised a request, did you raise it using get or post or put, or the last one is, let's say, delete. There are even more than that, but these are primary things that are getting used. So if I just go for, these are the four things that we are going to go and use in the current discussion today. So we will use get specifically for doing select all. We will be doing, let's say this is for select all. This is something that we will do for typical insert in this case. So here, And this is something which we will do for update, let's say, and delete is something that we will do for actual delete in memory also. So this kind of, you can say, combinations we do have, that is what kind of a commands you put up and what kind of, you can say, operations you would like to perform. So it's up to you how you want to deal with it. So now that we understand these basic things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back the context to our screen now. So I have this some number of records which I try to display in the form of JSON right now. So here is what I'll do. I'll take this content, and now, as I said, I have no intention of showing you the UI and putting the JSON and putting data